Samir, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's like a film by Jacques good morning again. Well, like I said, I'm an architect, but specifically on classical architecture. And this particular background is my reading of Jacques Ellul's Renaissance, about which I talked this morning. One of the salient characteristics of Jacques Ellul's L'Empire du Renaissance is that his critique of modernist art was based more on the texts that justified modernism and less on modernist art itself. He's less concerned with the clusters of positions elaborated by several artistic movements and architectural movements that include constructivism, futurism, cubism, the style, expressionism, so on and so forth. And he's more concerned with the fact that they were all informed by technique and that they in turn validated the technological milieu. Ellul engages modernist art from the outside, that is, using his concept of technique as a focusing lens. And while he also offers a genuine critique of modernist art, he is unwavering in his judgment that modernist art and his theory are justifications for the integration of humankind, quote, into the technicist complex, end quote. This characteristic sets him apart from others who oppose modernism from the inside, that is, on the grounds of art theory, architecture theory. Now, opponents of modernism usually assail its fundamental basis in historicism, in the cult of the zeitgeist, in industrialized mass production and abstraction, or the profound alienation felt in urban contexts where modernism dominates. The Prince of Wales was quite correct in stating that the Luftwaffe was kinder to London than the development that happened since the Second World War. Now, appropriate though these positions are, they could find further justification by incorporating Ellul's concept of technique. But unfortunately, Ellul's work is almost unknown among artists and architects in general. And L'Empire du Renaissance is virtually unknown even among French-speaking artists and architects. Now, artists and architects and their critics apprehend and make the world imagistic. And they apprehend and make modernity imagistic. That's, of course, the Macht. And that's what the Bach makes art. Ellul, by contrast, is a man of the word, whose sensibilities are more inclined towards symbolic content, to the meaning that should underlie artistic form and justify it. Much of his understanding of the world is mediated by the word, and less so by the image. In fact, Ellul was quite alarmed by the invasive proliferation of images in the technological society. The strong Protestant aesthetics played a significant role in this distress, which he expressed as a religious conflict between image and word. But Ellul is not an indiscriminate enemy of visual culture. He was most concerned about a particular kind of image, a triumphalist image whose empire humiliated the world, namely the technicist image. This image that frames the mind of citizens in the consumer society. Citizens of the technological society were consumers of technicist images, images that were justified by an ideology that glorified presentness as the leading edge of modernity. Space and visuality in modernist art and architecture, and also music, were expressions of technological processes, their operations. Artists and architects, we said, apprehended the world with images and made the world with images. This, however, is not to say that artists and architects are not concerned with meaning or symbolism. Indeed, they are acutely concerned with meaning. Only as makers of visual form, as makers of visual culture, they place a higher value on the image, on the form. Artists and architects desire form differently than focus. They desire form from the standpoint as makers of form. And these forms have a dialectical meaning that takes multiple directions. Artistic work is aimed towards society, and society returns meaning toward the artist, the artist. This condition obtains especially in a traditional society before technique became a system. Yet in a predominantly modernist culture, the overriding purpose for which artists and architects produce forms has more to do with self-expression than a contribution to the public realm. The sense in common, the general good. This phenomenon takes particular importance with respect to the idea of meaning in art and architecture, because modernism inherited and amplified the romantic belief in the artist or architect as a solitary genius who walks in no one's shadow and who produces forms that have not been seen before. The modernist rupture and transgression, to use these terms, the rupture and transgression of previous traditions assure the tabula rasa, where artists and architects can begin anew, while at the same time exponentially exalting their personae, by putting at their disposal all the massive means of technology. The theoretical justification of modernism shifted the artistic intent of elaborating a tradition toward a deepening interest in the artist's personal life, which itself became an object of art. Here we have a replacement of art by the artist. As the artist became a sacralized figure whose genius must always be valued and whose decisions are almost beyond judgment. Even the empty canvas became an object of art, itself a mute comment on a painting that could have been. And yet the act of withholding a painting from manifestation came to be endowed somehow with the aura of art. As if this intensely private meaning was precisely the reason why it ought to matter for society at large, a condition of no sense. This gesture has given its author, certainly, an emotional pleasure for having achieved something new by the very absence of artistic gesture. Of course, Ellul was exasperated, and then he said, quote, to apply exactly what the mentality of Epicurus demanded is no aesthetic creation at all. With such positions, the frenetic pursuit to distinguish oneself, especially undertaken by a considerable number of artists and architects over several decades, amounted to an exclusion of the sense in common, in favor of the self-referential side. Now, I'd like to briefly mention what I mean by the expression sense in common. That expression actually is distinguished from common sense. Sense in common distinguished from common sense, because common sense could be applied by simple habit. By contrast, sense in common designates sets of artistic conventions whose justification derives from the continual reflection, agreement, and disagreement between many free minds, contemplating the same aesthetic concerns and enriched by the wisdom of experience. This condition has been violently reversed in modernism, particularly among architects who frequently put self-expression over and above the idea that architecture as a public art is called to serve the city, the res publica. Ellul was little affected by the sophistics of modernist art theory, because he saw modernist art forms as technological forms situated and explained by a society that was meant to be technologically determined in the first place. Modernist art and architecture and their theory sought to form and conform the mind in a technological direction, literally a technological bent on child. Modernism claimed to be the only form of modernity possible. Indeed, it claimed to be the only possible reality for art and architecture as they were given the task to mold the physical forms of society accordingly. Previous forms and traditions that had been painstakingly elaborated over centuries, within a cultural sense in common, could therefore be iconoclastically discarded. Modernism became a monistic force that was justified by art and architecture historians and their critics as if it was a historical necessity, a panacea toward which all previous artistic forms led, as if in an unalterable direction. Apologists of modernism ardently argued for this belief, and some of them, like the futurists, for example, argued for shocking violence. In doing so, they produced conflations of far-reaching consequences, among which the conflict is the conflation of teleology with progress, as various historians of art and architecture wrote this conflation into their narratives. Yet, progress for artists, and especially for architects, has been deeply entangled in means. And when the technological means proliferated, it reminds us the ends for which the means were developed disappeared from sight. In fact, progress has not become such a routine belief that it passes unreflectively for a historical given. Yet, when some thinkers saw the weakening of the Enlightenment certainty regarding the progressive direction of history, they concluded that this was the dissolution of history itself. Others went further, arguing that the acceleration of events has proceeded so exponentially that it is now beyond our capacity to see them as history. Others still went on to propose that the immense network of self-referential signs within which the consumer society makes itself is such that now it becomes a condition that occupies the reality of experience. Paradoxically, although modernists championed their own work as a decisive rupture from historical precedents, they nonetheless cherished the idea that they were carried by the inexorable historical forces to the point they presently wish to occupy. For reasons such as these, many artists and architects rebelled after decades of proscriptive modernist control on artistic forms, on their history, on their explanations, and calling for a milieu that accepted plural artistic expressions. It is difficult for the mind that has been formed inside the technological system to differentiate between modernity and modernism. It is difficult for the mind who has been formed inside the technological society to differentiate between modernity as a reference to time and modernism as an artistic ideology. It is even more difficult for this same mind to understand some of the most enduring paradigms that influence artistic production in the past, such as the inseparable couple, imitation and invention. The enduring concept of imitation and invention allowed artists and architects, this is done 2 years ago, the enduring concept of imitation and invention allowed artists and architects to imitate nature and imitate established traditions. Contrary to that, however, architecture, contrary to painting and music and sculpture, architecture does not have a direct model in nature, with the exception of the cave as an original shelter or the forest as an original hypospine hall. Great theorists such as Roger and Catherine Merkelsi lucidly clarified that architecture had to invent paradigms that could be considered as natural models, as for example the idea of the primitive wooden hut that could be considered as an origin of both the house and the temple. Imitation in art and in architecture provided intellectual discipline, the theoretical foundations that enabled the painter, the sculptor, the architect to judiciously select and unify the best aspects of precedents from traditions with the expressions of their personal invention. Imitation produces the resemblance of an object inside another object that becomes its image. Imitation reveals one object within another. It implies a distance between a general type and a particular object or building. It affords us the kind of intellectual pleasure that precisely derives from recognizing and understanding that distance. Examples in sculpture are Canova's statue of Bonaparte as Mars and George Washington as Caesar. An example from architecture is Jefferson's indebtedness in the Virginia capital at Richmond to the Roman temple known as La Maison Carrée in Nîmes. The imitation is a resemblance, but it's an incomplete resemblance. It is rather a choice of qualities inherent to one object to be transposed into another object. Transposition is also transformation, where the qualities of one object are recognized within another object. Transposition and transformation operate on the notion of the fictive, and the fictive serves another kind of truth, artistic truth. Between the artistically true and the artistically factual stands the artistically fictive. Thus, Washington could be analogically assimilated to Caesar, and the state capital could be analogically expressed as a temple. Such an imitation is categorically distinguished from the copy, which repeats the reality of an object ad infinitum. The copy implies repetition, sameness, counterfeit. It's an object's very double. With modernism, the imitation collapsed into the copy. That is why, having rejected imitation, modernist theorists speak of simulacra. Now, prior to modernism, imitation meant that objects are made out of other objects, cities and buildings out of combinations of other cities and buildings, while invention sought to improve the rational choice made from exemplary precedents. With modernism, however, invention became an end in itself. The different facets of the same coin, imitation and invention, now became two identical facets, invention and invention. This separation was given currency and legitimacy by modernist art historians who wrote histories of art as histories of ruptures. The sequential passage from medieval to Renaissance, to Baroque, neoclassical, eclecticism, and so on and so forth, were all assured by rupture. And invention, we are told invention was the cause of this very rupture. Artistic and architectural production was now considered to be all invention, at the same time that imitation and invention came to be considered as antagonistic rather than complementary concepts. To be inventive meant that artists and architects were to practice creatio ex nihilo, creation, the making of objects out of nothing, following, of course, their own individualistic expressionism. Only artists and architects do not create any elementary sense of creation from nothing, because their forms are invariably based on older forms, even if they are the inversions or abstractions of previous forms. Instead, modernist forms have been made, situated, evaluated, judged with respect to technique as the value of all values. The big contradiction resided in the modernist claims to freeing the imagination and the invention, while wholeheartedly accepting technological determinism. The idea of technologically remaking the world, for modernist architects was based on the erroneous assumption that science, architectural art, were linked by one idea, the same idea of progress. Whether it is cities, buildings, ocean liners, automobiles, aircraft, furniture, or kitchen utensils, the technological society was to be made with technological products and be represented by these same products. Every product must be qualified by a technological character. This unassailable belief exerted some far-reaching consequences with respect to the idea of symbolism, symbolic thought, and artistic expression on architectural character. Because technology is both the symbol and the product, the true and the real, the signifier and the signified, the artistic idea and its representation converged, or rather collapsed into each other. If imitation and invention implied a certain transparency between an exemplar and the work of art, technique as a mentality presented an opacity of meanings outside of itself. For this reason, the symbolic ends, forms, meanings, and cultural conventions that previously allowed architecture to express a civic character and a private character were eclipsed. And yet, although modernist architects enthusiastically embraced this non-dialectical mode of technique, rather technological system, they still somehow wish their forms to symbolically represent the technological society. Because they still retain the traditional idea that any object acquires a symbolic function just because it was made. They justify their architecture as a reference to technology, while in reality it was technology. A symbol that recoils onto itself is a vicious circularity. A symbol that symbolizes itself is a condition of no sense. Modernist buildings are built in every continent, while belonging nowhere. This, by the way, is a building for a company that makes baskets. If any architectural character can be attached to a huge skeletal structure, then the result is kitsch, one of the most abundant phenomena of the technological society. This phenomenon is most evident in the confusion of genre that abound in this technological society, where a warehouse, for example, where a warehouse with a cross on its top, on its roof, conveys that it's a church, where an amorphous and sinusoidal vase might also be the shape of a theater, a library, perhaps a museum. Thus, when ordinary citizens engage in caricatural naming buildings, architects ought to listen, because naming calls forth an object's nature, its character. Naming lays bare the object's artistic truth. Thus, designating the Centre Pompidou in Beaubourg in Paris as an oil refinery shows the indelible sense that architects, that the citizens know exactly what architecture character ought to be. This is, of course, for those of you who are familiar, this was a architecture. This is a library. Yes. Of course, this is the capital of the universal capital of kitsch, Las Vegas. In many ways, the empire of technique is an empire of means. In many ways, the empire of technique is an empire of means. It means that exploded the limits or boundaries between the arts. Architecture could become sculpture, and vice versa. The keyboard of an electric organ produces the sounds of drums and cymbals. An artist who produces an artwork through a collage of unrelated photocopied images with varied colors is somehow considered at the same level as the painter. As the painter who composes and proportions a painting with a painstakingly judicious use of the brush, following years of assiduous training and introspection. But to a technicist's mind, the photocopier and the brush are both means that are equally received irrespective of artistic skill. And a technicist's mind, Ellul reminds us, considers that the proliferation of means is a necessary condition for artistic freedom. Only with this triumph, with the triumph of means, any combination of forms becomes possible, irrespective of the natural boundaries between the arts, irrespective of artistic genre or established modes of composition. And yet, contrary to prevalent belief, technique did not necessarily facilitate the expansion of artistic freedom, nor the quality of art. It is important to note that the augmentation of technical means has been accompanied by diminution in symbolic form. Thus, a distinction between an object of art wrought with skill and the multiplication of technological processes and products have been observed. Here we encounter one of the greatest paradoxes of technological society. On one hand, the proliferation of objects implies the triumph of the object. On the other, this very proliferation also means the obsolescence of the object, a condition of no sense. L'Empire du Non-Sens was published in 1980, and Ellul could not therefore account for the solid alternatives to modernism that developed since then. Even if the teaching and practice of art and architecture today remains predominantly modernistic, there are glimmers of hope that one discerns in academies and in professions. Several art schools and ateliers all over the world have now emerged where the study of nature, the human figure, beauty and proportions, landscape painting, historical subjects, realism, form part of the curriculum. There are at present 2 schools of architecture in the world that actually teach classical architecture, one of which is Notre Dame, where I have been teaching for the past 20 years. Following the hard-earned lessons of the Enlightenment, the practice of tradition will benefit by avoiding a blind faith in an unsurpassable and idealized past, and a blind faith in an unknown, idealized future that will somehow emerge from a technologically returned reality. As Ellul himself acknowledged, there is much in human nature that refuses to be integrated into a technological system that frames the true, the factual, and the possible. Thank you.
So we have time for just a couple of questions or comments. Who would like to be first? Yes, David.
Could you reflect a bit on the importance of the idea, or an imaginative universal, perhaps, Adam's hut?
Adam's hut?
Yes, David's referring,
You mentioned it.
right, David's referring to a particular book but that is also part of a larger discourse. There's a book written about 50 years ago by an architectural historian named Joseph Frickworth called On Adam's House in Paradise, dedicated to the idea of the hut, or the so-called primitive hut. This is, of course, a very, very old idea. It goes back to one of the earliest known treatises in architecture, written by the Roman architect Vitruvius, around 50 or so BC, a book dedicated to Damascus. But the idea, the discussion connects to the idea of a hut, but also the idea of a universal. Are there universals in architecture and what they might be? It's a huge question. Part of it is, here's a very, very quick answer. The notion of type, typology in architecture is actually one such a universal, to which actually I dedicated a book 15 years ago or so. The idea of type is out of the universal. One way to explain that is as follows. We can compare a type, contrast a type to a model, if you will. A type is something fairly, a type is not a buildable idea yet, but it's actually an idea around which many buildings can cluster. A model is something quite exact. An analogy from sculpture is that if one, let me put it this way, if we all know the story of Zeuxis, Z-E-U-X-I-S, Zeuxis, who painted Helen. He was supposed to be asked by the inhabitants of Croton to paint the most beautiful woman in the world. What does she look like? He presumably asked all the inhabitants of Croton to choose the 5 most beautiful women, from whom he composed one person, one embodiment, by choosing disparate parts. Hence the notion of an ideal. So once you actually present Helen, or in case of Canova, I'll show you an example. Canova, the Venus Italica. The Venus Italica, or Helen, is not a particular woman. It's woman in general. That's the analogy of type to a particular object. If we look at the sculptures of Voltaire, like Pigalle, for example, it shows you Voltaire half naked, and he's 80-some years old, and he's wrinkled. That's the model. That's the particular. The type is much more universal. Of course, no one recognizes Bonaparte in Canova's Mars, with the exception of a little bit of the facial features. So the type is much, much more universal, and the model is particular. The Pantheon, Rome, the Taurus, Greece, the stupa of Sanchi, the Buddha's stupa in India, the US Capitol Dome, they're all the same type. It's the circular type. But yet these are dissimilar buildings. So the type is a universal, and then the applications are particular and regional.
Okay, one more comment? Yes.
When you make a distinction between in art between self-expression and expression commonality, are we talking about the intention of the artist or the reaction of an audience?
Well, what has happened with modernism is a rupture between that which is artistically given and precedent. Now here we have to qualify what exactly precedent means, because the simple fact that something has happened before doesn't necessarily make a precedent that one can use operative. That would be irrational. But if it's actually valid precedent, it would be irrational to discard it. This applies particularly to rational law arts, to craft skills, to architecture, to which make them. The elaboration of artistic culture is never a collective endeavor. The elaboration of language, no one person has made language, is actually part of a collective endeavor. So therefore, it is passed on, it's refined, it's constantly refined and changed. That which works would be rational to maintain it. That which doesn't work would be irrational to keep it. So it's evolving. That's what the idea of tradition implies, by definition, that it's constantly being worked and reworked and refined. A tradition that only means something that has happened in the past is actually a cessation of tradition. One cannot speak, therefore, of a living tradition. And that is actually, unfortunately, what the institution of the museum has done. The museum has actually interposed itself between the use of art, of architecture, and our daily use of it, because we put it in the museum, we block it. Therefore, we have little connection back to it. Of course, the museum has had a good side to it as well. It made art available to the masses because it's in the salon before that. But in the process, I have actually isolated Martin's daily operative use. So really, the elaboration of the artistic tradition could only happen by several minds reflecting together about the same concerns. Several free minds reflecting together about the same concerns.
Scott, did you have something quickly?
I'll just bring maybe quickly the use of historic forms in propaganda is sort of an interesting inversion of what you're saying. You presented a lot of the modernist paintings as you were talking about technique engaging in propaganda. But what we actually see now are the use of these historic forms, these images, to essentially sell. So I think a lot of architects are contending with this fact of historicism represented in these propagandistic images and finding it very difficult to then allow for that kind of real traditional, let's say, and vital production of work in a traditional vein. I don't know if there's anything you can say to that briefly.
Yes.
1 minute.
1 minute.
Oh. Well, the word historicism that you use possesses at least 3 meanings. The way you use it is to say the use of historic form. But historicism actually is not. It's the idea that it's a determinism of history that has led as a panacea to the abolition of modernism. These are the true historicists. The modernists have also used whatever the previous architecture and actually politicized. And said actually classical architecture must be the example of a tyrannical empire and so on and so forth. Read many architectural history books, and that's what you find. This has probably completely an intellectual falsehood, really. And here's why. If you look at the architecture done in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, in the United States, in Germany, in Australia, in England, it was all classical architecture. But yet in the US, it's called the federal presence. In Germany, it's called fascist architecture. In Italy, fascist architecture. And in England, imperial architecture. But it's the same architecture, roughly. So therefore, architecture herself is innocent of the political uses that are made of her.
Interesting. Thank you, Samir.